Do you ever look at life and just think, I wish things were better? And a follow-up question to that would be, what do you do to make things better? See, a lot of times it's easy to just sit around and see the problems that we face and to point those problems out and to bicker, complain, and even become miserable about the situation. I think it's human nature. Rather than seeing any good, we're sort of programmed to see the bad. And the result of that is a negative attitude, a complaining, and an ungrateful heart. In Numbers chapter 11, there's a story of when the nation of Israel complained. I want to read you a portion of it. Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned from among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. One of the things you'll see constantly if you read Numbers and you read about Israel in the wilderness is that they were very unhappy at various points. Some of their unhappiness we can understand. They didn't have adequate food, they didn't have adequate water, but rather than just immediately complaining, I think what God wanted them to do was just turn to him in faith and just ask for whatever they needed or for whatever they wanted. And I think it's kind of a pattern that we've fallen into as well. We see something wrong, we complain, rather than just turning to God and praying and asking for whatever it is we want. Now, there are things that are legitimate to complain about. I wouldn't doubt that in the least. There are things that are wrong, that are unjust, things that are just plain sin that give us every reason to complain. But the thing about it that we may not realize is that complaining damages us physically. There was a research done at Stanford University, and it says that a half an hour of regular complaining can physically damage a person's brain. The negativity peels back neurons in the area of our brain, which is called the hippocampus. I think that's how you say it. And that deals with problem solving, emotion, memory, and knowledge, or cognitive functioning. So when we complain, we're more likely to become more aggravated, which in turn leads to a release of the stress hormone cortisol. And this hormone floods our bloodstreams each time we complain. And rather than a good old rant making us feel better, it actually results in further frustration. Now, when you think about the amount of time you and I spend complaining, you think, man, I have really damaged myself, some of us may think. So, what can we do if we're going to remove complaining from our lives? Because if you want things to be better, then you and I have to become better people. Be the change you want to see. Now, there are things that we can control. There are certain situations and circumstances we can move around and help with certain situations. But then there are things we can't do a thing about. And so when we feel helpless and can't do a thing about certain things, we resort to complaining. And when we resort to complaining, we damage our brain and we treat our brain to become wired in a way that is prone to negativity. And this release of the stress hormone cortisol floods in our bloodstream, and it just perpetuates a cycle of frustration and anger and negativity. So, you want things to be better? We have to look in the mirror and begin with ourselves. First of all, Paul wrote to the Philippians in 4:8. He said, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." So the first step we can take to overcoming our problem with complaining is to redirect our focus. If we focus constantly on bad situations and negativity, then that's how our minds will often be. Now, I try to be a positive person myself, but there are times that I'm pretty negative and that I'm complaining as well. And you know, the nature of the work that I do, I was speaking with someone recently who is a therapist, and we were talking about the nature of our work, him as a therapist, me as a minister. You know, a lot of times people bring their problems to us, and that somewhat weighs on us. But if it weighed on us as much as it weighed on them, then, you know, we would be very, very hopeless people, very negative people. And so we have to find ways to cope and to overcome. And one way is when we have to meet with people who are going through hard times, whose families are suffering, whose marriages are falling apart, whose children have chosen ways of sin rather than following a path of righteousness. This is very personal to many folks. And so what we have to do with all the negativity that comes in, we have to then find things that are noble, just, pure, lovely, good report, virtue, and anything that's praiseworthy. We have to supplement and offset the negativity that comes in with the goodness that comes in. And we should do this mainly because we are Christians and we should see life a certain way. You know, to see a miserable Christian it really should almost be an oxymoron. All Christians should be happy, not that their heads are buried in the sand and they don't acknowledge realities, but that if they do see issues, they can do what they can do to help make things better and then entrust the results to God. Because complaining becomes a habit, and due partly to this physical damage that the brain suffers, it's very easy for complaining to become a habit, and the more we complain, the easier it becomes to complain again, and before we know it, we have made complaining an Olympic sport. And it's a hard habit to break, but it is possible that we actually break this negativity and complaining. So the more we actively stop ourselves from moaning and groaning and complaining, the more we'll hopefully actively build good habits. And we can see the best in people and find glimpses of hope even in darkness. Now, things begin to change and will begin to change when we stop looking inward and we start looking upward. And whenever we look upward to God, we have every reason to be grateful. One thing that might be particularly helpful is to write down 5 things you're thankful for every day, or verbalize that. This was something that was suggested to me. You know, verbalize 5 things that you're grateful for every single day. Or if you want, if you're a journaler, you can write those down and talk about them. You know, I'm grateful that my family is healthy. I'm grateful that my daughter is safe. I'm grateful that I get to be the minister here at Glendale Road Church of Christ. I'm grateful that I have such a supportive church, even in my own shortcomings and struggles of life. But I'm also thankful for what we as a church community, as a church family rather, do to serve our community. Now tomorrow, when I name 5 things that I'll be grateful, I'm going to look for different things. And so the more and more I can be grateful verbally, the more my brain and mind will reset and change, and I'll be a more positive person, and I won't be drawn to looking at the negative. Psalm 118, verse 1 says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and for his mercies endure forever." One of the things about eliminating complaints from our life is that we have to realize that it doesn't do anybody around us any good. We could be the very impetus to someone else's unhappiness by our incessant complaining. So when we complain, it doesn't just affect us, but it can affect other people around us. And we bring them down, we pull them into our despair, when really we should take that opportunity to help people look through heavenly eyes and to point people away from our complaints to the God who makes beauty out of troubling times. I've mentioned to this church family before this Japanese art called, I believe it's called kintsugi, and it means in English golden joinery. You see, if you or I drop a cup or a dish, we just sweep it up and throw it away. But in Japan, if they drop dishes or cups or saucers or whatever the case is, they will use this gold epoxy or a silver epoxy, and they'll put it back together. And so that when it is dry, it's as good to use as it was before. But the Japanese look at those gold trails around this piece of pottery, and rather than throwing it away, they sort of celebrate the imperfection of their cup or their saucer or their plate or whatever might have been broken. And so they see beauty in the damaged things. And so we can look at life even in its ugliness, and we can be grateful and find beauty. I know sometimes certain circumstances, it's hard to find something positive to come out of it. But I was meeting with someone recently who was talking about a situation they were facing and how they went to a support group for folks facing this situation. And they said, I heard stories a lot worse than mine. And I said, yeah. I said, you'll often do that if you get in a group of people that are suffering in similar ways. I said, but the thing is, we should never feel guilty about feeling bad for what we're going through just because others have it worse. I think what we can do, and when we know that others have it worse than we do, is focus somewhat on the good. Now I may have it bad, but I don't have it that bad. So I can be grateful, I can be thankful that even in my miserable situation, I don't have it as bad as what they've gone through. So, there's a way, even in our damagedness, that we can find positivity. And so we can live lives that conform to Philippians 2, verses 14 and 15, which is what I think we ought to strive to do. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may be blameless and harmless, children of God without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. One of the things that does not distinguish us from the crooked and perverse generation in which we live is when we, who are supposed to be people of hope and joy, are people who complain and are miserable and unhappy at every single turn. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount to his audience before him, you are the light of the world. Go forth and let your light so shine. A light doesn't shine through complaints, but rather is overshadowed by complaints. When we do all things without complaining and disputing, we do so that we can become blameless and harmless children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. And then we can shine the light of Jesus. People might even go, how are you able to bear up under the things that you're facing? And you can go, well, I have faith in God, and I know it could be worse. And so I'm thankful that it isn't even any worse than what it could be. I mean, how many of us over the past couple of weeks with the ice and the snow were complaining? I was on a few occasions go, oh gosh, I hate this cold. And I hated it more when I had to take the dogs out. Little dogs still have to go outside and potty even when it's sub-zero. I hated that. Oh, I was complaining. But you know what? I still had power. I still had heat. Oh, I can't get out and go anywhere. That's okay. I've got food in the house. I didn't have any pipes burst. There's always something, even in the middle of a bad situation, that we can look and be thankful for. And we should be grateful people because, we're so fortunate in many, many ways when we look at what others suffer through. I mean, look at Texas, for example. Texas has suffered a winter storm for which they just weren't prepared because they don't experience that like what we do maybe every couple of years or so. And so many of them have suffered, and there have been those who have lost their lives to the cold, sadly. So for all the reasons you and I can think to complain, let's try and find reasons as children of God to be grateful. And let's rewire our brains to be brains that are focused on the positive, that are focused on being grateful for the blessings that we have. And as Paul says, let's let our light shine through that. Thank you for joining us. And we won't have a recorded lesson next week because we are returning to in-person services. We invite you to come and to join us on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. We will have classes for adults. We will also have classes for children, and they will be with mask and socially distanced. So we invite you to join us in person next week if you're able to do so. But we are glad that we've been able to do this for you in the interim until we're able to get back to that point. But thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you here soon.